The Arizona desert stretched endlessly before Clara Jennings, a merciless expanse of red earth and jagged rock that seemed to mock her very existence. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, painting the horizon in shades of burnt orange and deep crimson, while the wind whipped sand against the weathered walls of the Stagecoach station. She sat on a rough wooden bench outside, her traveling dress already coated with a fine layer of dust that had settled into every fold and seam. In her gloved hands, she clutched a letter that had arrived 3 days prior, its edges now soft from repeated handling. The words, penned in her cousin Martha's tight script, burned in her memory. "We regret to inform you that our circumstances have changed considerably. The position we discussed is no longer available, and we cannot accommodate additional members in our household at this time." Clara folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into her small leather satchel. 6 months had passed since outlaws had gunned down her husband Samuel outside their small ranch near Tucson. 6 months of trying to hold on to land she couldn't work alone, of fighting off creditors and the unwanted advances of men who saw a young widow as easy prey. She had sold everything, the ranch, the livestock, even Samuel's pocket watch, to purchase passage east to Boston, where Martha had promised her work in their millinery shop. Now that promise lay as broken as the pottery shards scattered near the station's water trough. "Stage will be here within the hour, ma'am." The station master, a grizzled man named Jeremiah Polk, emerged from the small adobe building, his eyes nestled deep in a face carved by decades of desert sun, regarded her with a mixture of pity and wariness. "You got somewhere particular you're headed?" Clara straightened her spine, a gesture that had become second nature since Samuel's death. Show no weakness, trust no one too quickly. These were the rules of survival for a woman alone on the frontier. "East," she replied simply. "As far as this ticket will take me." Polk nodded, scratching his gray beard. "Well, you picked a good guard for the journey. Luke Carson's riding shotgun on this run. Ain't no finer man with a Winchester in all the territory." As if summoned by his name, a tall figure emerged from behind the station, leading a pair of horses to the water trough. Clara found herself studying him with the careful attention she'd learned to apply to any stranger. Luke Carson stood well over 6 feet, his broad shoulders filling out a dust-colored duster that had seen better days. A well-worn Colt rested on his hip, and he carried a Winchester rifle with the easy familiarity of a man who'd made friends with danger long ago. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, gray as a winter storm, yet strangely calm. When he glanced her way, tipping his wide-brimmed hat in greeting, she saw neither the predatory interest nor the dismissive contempt she'd grown accustomed to from men, just a quiet acknowledgement of her presence. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low and measured, "you'll be on the Tucson run?" "Yes." Clara met his gaze steadily. "Is there cause for concern?" Luke's weathered hands paused in checking his rifle. "There's always cause for concern in this country, ma'am, but I've made this run more times than I can count. We'll see you through safe." The way he said it, not as a boast but as a simple statement of fact, stirred something in Clara that she quickly suppressed. She had no room in her life for stirrings of any kind. Her heart had been buried with Samuel, and her focus now was survival. Nothing more. The distant sound of horses and wheels on hard-packed earth announced the stagecoach's arrival. It rolled into view like something out of a desert mirage. A Concord coach, its red paint faded and chipped, pulled by 6 sturdy horses that looked as tough as the land they crossed. The driver, a wiry man with arms like knotted rope, brought the team to a halt in a cloud of dust. "10 minutes to change horses," he called out. "Then we roll." Clara watched as Luke moved with practiced efficiency, checking the coach's undercarriage, examining the wheels, testing the leather thoroughbraces that would be their only cushion against the brutal jolts of the trail. His movements were economical, purposeful, a man who wasted nothing, neither motion nor words. Other passengers began to emerge from the station, a portly merchant mopping his brow with a silk handkerchief, a young couple who clung to each other as if the desert might tear them apart, and a sharp-eyed gambler whose fancy vest couldn't quite hide the bulge of a concealed derringer. "Folks," Luke addressed them all, his voice carrying natural authority. "We'll be traveling through the night to make Hayfield Station by dawn. Keep your belongings secure and your weapons handy but holstered. If there's trouble, you follow my lead." "Questions?" The merchant raised a pudgy hand. "I heard tell the Morrison gang's been active near Devil's Canyon." "You heard right," Luke replied without hesitation. "Which is why we'll be taking the northern route through Apache Pass. Longer, but safer." Clara noticed how his hand unconsciously checked the ammunition loops on his gun belt as he spoke. This was a man who'd learned that survival meant constant vigilance. She understood that all too well. As she climbed aboard the coach, accepting Luke's steadying hand for just a moment, Clara felt the weight of her few remaining possessions in her carpet bag. Everything she owned in the world, everything that connected her to the life she'd built with Samuel, fit in one small bag. The thought might have crushed her 6 months ago. Now it felt almost like freedom, or would have, if freedom didn't taste so much like dust and smell so much like fear. The interior of the coach was cramped and hot, despite the approaching evening. Clara positioned herself by the window, where she could watch the landscape roll by and avoid the inevitable questions from curious fellow passengers. The young woman across from her kept stealing glances, clearly dying to ask about a woman traveling alone. "All aboard," the driver called, and with a lurch that threw them all back against their seats, the coach began to move. Through the window, Clara watched the station recede into the distance, another milestone in her journey away from everything she'd known. The wheels found their rhythm on the hard-packed trail, and the coach settled into a steady, rocking motion that would, she knew, become tortuous over the hours ahead. As they cleared the first rise, Luke Carson appeared at the window, riding alongside on a sturdy bay mare. He touched his hat brim to her again, then spurred ahead to take his position beside the driver. From her vantage point, Clara could see him clearly, back straight, rifle across his lap, eyes constantly scanning the horizon for danger. The sun continued its descent, painting the desert in shades of gold and shadow. Saguaro cacti stood like silent sentinels, their arms raised to the darkening sky. In the distance, the mountains loomed purple and mysterious, holding secrets and dangers in their rocky embraces. Clara allowed herself one last look back. Though she couldn't have said what she hoped to see, the past was a closed door, the future uncertain as the desert wind. All she had was this moment, the rhythm of hooves on earth, the creak of leather and wood, and the steady presence of a gray-eyed guard who'd promised to see her through safe as darkness began to claim the desert. Clara closed her eyes and tried not to think about how many promises had already been broken, or how many miles stretched between her and any kind of real safety. In the gathering gloom, she heard Luke's voice calling out to the driver, steady and sure, and found an unexpected comfort in it. The stagecoach rolled on, carrying its human cargo deeper into the night, while somewhere in the darkness, coyotes began their ancient song. Clara Jennings, widow, survivor, and woman with nowhere left to go but forward, settled in for the long journey ahead. The desert night descended upon them like a heavy blanket, transforming the familiar landscape into an alien world of shadows and whispered threats. The temperature, which had been near unbearable during the day, plummeted until Clara found herself pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Through the coach window, stars emerged one by one, then in multitudes, until the sky blazed with cold fire. They reached Coyote Springs Way Station just as the last traces of purple faded from the western horizon. It was a sorry excuse for shelter adobe walls crumbling at the corners, a roof that looked more hope than substance, and a corral that had seen better decades. But it meant fresh horses, water, and a chance to stretch cramped limbs. 30 minutes, folks, the driver announced, climbing down stiffly from his perch. Get some grub if you can stomach it. Tend to your needs. Clara stepped down from the coach, her legs protesting after hours of being folded into the cramped space. The station keeper, a one-eyed Mexican named Miguel, had set out a meal of sorts. tough beef, harder biscuits, and coffee that could strip paint. The other passengers gathered around the rough plank table inside, but Clara found herself drawn to the relative solitude of the outdoors. She stood near the corral, watching the fresh team being hitched, when she heard footsteps behind her. Without turning, she knew it was Luke Carson. Something about his presence, solid, unobtrusive, was already becoming familiar. "You should eat something, ma'am," he said quietly. "It's a long way to the next station. I have some provisions." Clara turned to face him, noticing how the firelight from inside the station cast shadows across his weathered features. "Mr. Carson, may I ask you something?" He nodded, leaning his rifle carefully against the corral fence. "How long have you been riding guard?" "Going on 8 years now." His gray eyes swept the darkness beyond the station, never completely at rest. "Started when I mustered out of the cavalry at Fort Grant. And before that, a ghost of something? Memory, perhaps, or old pain flickered across his face. Virginia, originally. The war changed that, like it changed most everything." Clara understood. The war had redrawn the map of countless lives, sending men and women spinning across the continent like seeds on the wind. She'd been just a girl in Ohio when it ended, but she'd seen the hollow-eyed veterans returning, searching for homes that no longer existed, for people who no longer knew them. "I lost my husband 6 months ago," she found herself saying, surprising them both. "Outlaws. They wanted our horses, and Samuel, he tried to stop them." Luke's expression didn't change, but something in his stance shifted, became more protective. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. I'm not looking for sympathy." Clara straightened, meeting his eyes directly. "I just thought, you strike me as a man who understands loss." "That I do." He picked up his rifle, checking it with automatic precision. "Lost my brother at Antietam, my wife to fever, 2 years after." The simple statement hung between them in the desert air. Clara felt a strange kinship with this quiet man who carried his grief without display, who'd learned to live with absence as a constant companion. From inside the station came the sounds of the other passengers, the merchant complaining about the accommodations, the young couple whispering together, the gambler shuffling cards with practiced ease. Out here, under the vast arch of stars, there was only the soft nickering of horses and the distant yip of coyotes. "Time to load up," the driver called. As they prepared to board again, Luke paused beside Clara. From inside his coat, he pulled out a folded blanket, good wool, military issue by the look of it. "Desert gets cold at night," he said, offering it to her. "You'll need this more than I will." Clara hesitated. In her experience, men's gestures of kindness often came with expectations. But looking into Luke Carson's calm gray eyes, she saw only simple human decency, a commodity rarer than gold in this harsh land. "Thank you," she said, accepting the blanket. The coach rolled out of Coyote Springs into full darkness. Inside, Clara wrapped herself in Luke's blanket, inhaling the scents of leather and sage and something indefinably masculine. The young woman across from her had fallen asleep on her husband's shoulder, while the merchant snored in the corner. Only the gambler remained alert, his sharp eyes glinting in the darkness. They'd been traveling perhaps 2 hours when the coach began to slow. Clara heard Luke's voice from above, low and urgent, conferring with the driver. The other passengers stirred, sensing the change. "What's happening?" the merchant demanded, his voice high with alarm. Before anyone could answer, the coach came to a complete stop. Clara peered out the window but could see nothing beyond the faint starlight on rocks and brush. Then Luke appeared at the coach door. "Folks, we've got a situation," he said calmly. "Looks like there's been a rock slide across the trail ahead. We'll need to backtrack to the fork and take the lower trail." The gambler leaned forward. "The lower trail goes through Skeleton Canyon." "It does," Luke acknowledged. "But it's that, or try to clear the slide in the dark, which could take hours we don't have." Clara caught the look that passed between Luke and the driver. There was more to this decision than a simple detour. Skeleton Canyon had a reputation, and not a good one. As the coach carefully turned around on the narrow trail, Clara found herself gripping the window frame. The blanket Luke had given her provided warmth, but no comfort against the growing tension. Even the horses seemed nervous, their hooves dancing uncertainly on the rocky ground. They found the fork and turned onto the lower trail. Here the desert gave way to rougher country towering rock formations that blocked out sections of sky, narrow passages that forced the coach to slow to a crawl. The darkness seemed deeper here, more oppressive. "I don't like this," the young woman whispered, pressing closer to her husband. "James, I'm frightened." "Hush now, Ellen," her husband soothed, though his own voice betrayed nervousness. "The guard knows what he's doing." Through the window, Clara could see Luke riding closer to the coach now, his rifle no longer resting across his lap but held ready. The driver had fallen silent, all his concentration on navigating the treacherous trail. Then she heard it, a sound that made her blood run cold, the long, mournful howl of a wolf, answered by another, then another, but there was something about these howls, something that spoke more of calculation than wildness. "Those ain't wolves," the gambler said quietly, his hand moving to his vest. Luke appeared at the window again. "Everyone stay calm and stay down," he instructed. "We're going to run this next stretch fast. Hold on to something." The whip cracked, and the coach lurched forward with surprising speed. Clara braced herself as they careened through the darkness, the coach swaying dangerously on the rough trail. She could hear Luke's horse keeping pace, could imagine him scanning the ridges above for any sign of threat. They'd nearly cleared the narrowest part of the canyon when it happened. A shot rang out, echoing off the canyon walls, followed immediately by the driver's curse. More shots followed, muzzle flashes lighting up the darkness like deadly fireflies. "Everyone down!" Luke's voice carried over the chaos. Clara found herself on the floor of the coach, pressed between the seats with the other passengers. The young woman was sobbing quietly while her husband tried to shield her with his body. The merchant was praying in a continuous, terrified whisper. Only the gambler remained somewhat composed, his derringer now in hand. The coach thundered on, Luke's rifle answering the attacks from above. Clara could hear the drivers shouting at the horses, urging them to greater speed despite the dangerous terrain. A bullet punched through the coach roof, showering them with splinters. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the shooting stopped. The coach continued its wild flight for another mile before finally slowing to a more manageable pace. Clara cautiously raised her head. Seeing the other passengers doing the same, Luke appeared at the window once more, and in the starlight, Clara could see a dark stain on his sleeve. "Everyone all right in there?" he asked. "We're fine," Clara answered when no one else seemed able to speak. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." He glanced back the way they'd come. "We're clear now. Another hour to Hayfield Station." But Clara could see the pain he was trying to hide, the way he held his left arm close to his body. Without thinking, she began tearing strips from her petticoat. "What are you doing?" Ellen asked, eyes wide. "What needs doing?" Clara replied, then called out to Luke. "Mr. Carson, you need that wound tended, please." For a moment she thought he'd refuse, but then he dismounted and climbed partially into the coach, in the confined space. Clara could smell gunpowder and blood mixed with the desert dust. She worked quickly, efficiently, skills learned from helping Samuel with ranch injuries serving her now. The wound was a furrow along his upper arm, painful but not serious if kept clean. As she wrapped the makeshift bandage, she was aware of the solid warmth of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing despite the pain he must be feeling. "Thank you," he said quietly when she finished, his gray eyes meeting hers in the darkness. "Thank you," she countered, "for keeping your promise to see us through safe." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding born of shared danger, a recognition of strength meeting strength. Then Luke was back on his horse, and the coach was moving again through the night. They reached Hayfield Station as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn. As Clara descended from the coach on shaking legs, still wrapped in Luke's blanket, she realized that somewhere in the violence and fear of the night, something had shifted. The wall she'd built around her heart since Samuel's death had developed a crack, small but undeniable. She watched Luke conferring with the station master, his torn and bloodied sleeve a testament to the night's dangers, and felt something she'd thought lost forever, the stirring of hope, fragile as desert flower but just as persistent. The night had tested them all, but they'd survived. And in this hard land, sometimes survival itself was a form of grace. The respite at Hayfield Station proved brief. Just as the sun crested the eastern mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose, Luke Carson spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. He'd been standing watch while the passengers ate a hurried breakfast, his wounded arm freshly bandaged by the station keeper's wife, when that telltale sign of riders appeared. "How many?" The driver, Tom Briggs, asked quietly, joining Luke at his vantage point. "Hard to say. 8, maybe 10. Luke's expression remained calm, but Clara, watching from the doorway, saw his hand drop to his Colt. "Moving fast, keeping to the ridgeline. Same bunch from last night." "Could be, or could be the Morrison gang heard about our little detour." Luke turned to the station keeper. "You got a place for the passengers?" The keeper, a former Buffalo soldier named Abraham Washington, nodded grimly. "Root cellar out back. Reinforced it myself after the last raid." Clara felt her heart begin to race, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "How long before they reach us?" Luke met her eyes, and she saw approval there for her composure. 20 minutes, maybe less. Then we'd better move." Clara turned to the other passengers, who were frozen in various states of alarm. "You heard Mr. Carson. We need to get to shelter." The next few minutes were controlled chaos. Abraham's wife, Martha, herded Ellen and James toward the root cellar, while the merchant clutched his valise as if it contained the crown jewels. The gambler, who'd introduced himself as Doc Holliday, though Clara doubted that was his real name, checked his derringer with practiced ease. "Mrs. Jennings." Luke appeared at her elbow as she helped gather water jugs. "I need to ask you something." She looked up at him, noting the serious set of his jaw. "Can you handle a firearm?" "My husband taught me to shoot a Henry rifle." She replied, "I'm no sharpshooter, but I can hit what I aim at." Without hesitation, Luke handed her a spare Colt revolver from his gun belt. 6 shots. Make them count if it comes to that." The weight of the weapon in her hand brought back memories of Samuel teaching her to shoot behind their ranch house, his patient voice explaining sight alignment and trigger squeeze. She pushed the memories aside and nodded. "I'll help with the defense," she said. "No." Luke's tone brooked no argument. "You'll stay with the others unless the cellar is breached. That's not negotiable." Before she could protest, the drumming of hoofbeats became audible. Luke pressed a box of ammunition into her hands along with the pistol. "Just in case," he said, then surprised her by briefly touching her cheek. "Stay safe, Clara." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and something about it, the intimacy of it in this moment of danger, made her throat tight. Then he was gone, taking position at one of the station's reinforced windows. Clara descended into the root cellar with the others. It was a cramped space, smelling of earth and preserved vegetables, but the walls were thick adobe reinforced with timber. Martha Washington lit a single lantern, casting wavering shadows on the frightened faces around her. "Don't you worry none," Martha said, her voice calm from years of frontier living. "My Abrahams faced down Apaches and outlaws alike. He'll see us through." Above them, Clara could hear boots on floorboards, the metallic sound of weapons being readied. Then, eerily, silence fell. The merchant's labored breathing seemed thunderous in the confined space. Ellen clung to James, her knuckles white. Doc shuffled a deck of cards with nervous energy. The silence stretched, taut as a bowstring, until Clara thought she might scream from the tension. Then Luke's voice rang out. clear and carrying. "That's close enough. Gentlemen, state your business." A rough voice answered, the words muffled but the tone unmistakably hostile. Clara strained to hear, pressing closer to the cellar door. "We don't want trouble," Luke continued, "but we'll give it if pressed. You'd best move along." This time the response was clearer, harsh laughter followed by what could only be profanity. Clara's hand tightened on the Colt. She knew that laugh, that kind of cruel mirth that preceded violence. "They're spreading out," Doc observed quietly. He'd positioned himself where a crack in the door allowed a sliver of view. "Trying to flank the station." The first shot shattered the morning stillness, followed immediately by a fusillade that seemed to come from all directions. The cellar trembled with the impact of bullets on adobe walls. Dust sifted down from the ceiling as the battle raged above. Clara could distinguish different weapons now, the sharp crack of rifles, the deeper boom of shotguns, the rapid fire of pistols. Luke's Winchester had a distinctive sound, methodical and deadly accurate. She found herself counting his shots, holding her breath between each one. "They're trying for the corral," someone shouted above. "Tom Briggs," she thought. More shooting, and the terrified screaming of horses. Time lost meaning in the cellar. Minutes felt like hours, each second stretched by fear and uncertainty. The merchant had progressed from prayer to a kind of shocked silence. Ellen wept quietly in James's arms. Even Doc had stopped shuffling his cards. Then Clara heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps on the cellar door above them. Not the measured tread of friends, but stealthy, careful movements. "Get back," she hissed to the others. "Raising the Colt." The door exploded inward, and a figure descended. Dirty, wild-eyed, pistol raised. Clara didn't think, didn't hesitate. The Colt bucked in her hand, and the outlaw tumbled down the stairs, his weapon clattering away. "Good Lord," the merchant gasped. Clara kept the pistol trained on the fallen man, but he wasn't moving. Her hands were steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. Samuel's voice echoed in her memory. "When it's your life or theirs, you don't hesitate. Clara, you can't afford to." More footsteps above, but these were hurried, friendly. "Clara, Mrs. Jennings," Luke's voice, tight with concern. "We're all right," she called back. "One got through, but—" Luke appeared in the doorway, taking in the scene with a quick glance. Something flickered in his gray eyes. Relief, certainly, but also something deeper, more personal. "It's over," he said. "They've pulled back." The passengers emerged from the cellar like moles blinking in sunlight. The station showed the scars of battle bullet holes pocking the walls. Windows shot out, furniture overturned, but the defenders had held. Abraham Washington nursed a grazed scalp. Tom Briggs had taken pellet shot to his shoulder, and Luke's earlier wound had reopened, fresh blood seeping through Clara's makeshift bandage. But they were alive. "Lost 2 horses, Tom reported grimly. "And they got away with some supplies from the storehouse. But it could have been worse. Would have been, if not for some mighty fine shooting," Abraham added, nodding respectfully to Luke. "Saw you drop their leader at 50 yards. Rest lost their taste for fighting after that." As Martha Washington tended the wounded and the passengers tried to compose themselves, Clara found herself standing with Luke by the ruined window. The desert had reclaimed its peace, giving no sign of the violence that had just passed. "You did well," Luke said quietly, "keeping your head, protecting the others. I did what needed doing." She looked at his bleeding arm. "You need that properly tended." In a moment, he turned to face her fully, and Clara saw something in his expression she hadn't expected. Vulnerability. "When I heard that shot from the cellar, when I thought—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "I'm fine," Clara said softly. "We're all fine, thanks to you." "No," Luke shook his head. "I've ridden guard for 8 years, seen more fights than I can count, but this time—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. This time it mattered differently. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken possibilities. Clara felt the pull of it, dangerous as any outlaw's gun. She'd built her walls so carefully after Samuel's death, brick by brick of grief and determination. But this quiet, gray-eyed man was finding the cracks, seeping through like water in the desert. Impossible to stop. "Mr. Carson," she began, but he interrupted gently. "Luke," he said. "Just Luke. Luke." The name felt right on her lips, solid and true. "We hardly know each other." "I know enough." His hand covered hers where it rested on the windowsill. "I know you're brave. I know you're strong. I know when I saw you in danger, something in me." He trailed off, frustrated by the inadequacy of words. Clara understood. In this harsh land, connections formed quickly or not at all. The luxury of long courtships, of gradual acquaintance, belonged to safer places. Here, you learn to read character quickly, to trust your instincts, to recognize kindred spirits when they appeared. "The stage will be leaving soon," she said, not pulling her hand away. "Yes." Luke's thumb traced a gentle pattern on her wrist. "You'll continue east. I have nowhere else to go. You could stay," he said quietly. "There's work in the towns, good people who'd help you start over." Clara looked out at the desert, harsh and beautiful in the morning light. "And you? Will you keep riding guard?" "It's what I know, what I'm good at." He paused. "But a man can change his plans, given reason enough." Before Clara could respond, Tom Briggs called out that they'd be leaving in 10 minutes. The spell broke, and she withdrew her hand, stepping back. "I should gather my things," she said. Luke nodded, but as she turned to go, he spoke again. "Clara, whatever you decide, wherever you go, I'm glad for this. For knowing you, even briefly." She looked back at him. This man who'd kept his promise to see her through safe, who'd given her his blanket against the cold and his trust in the fight, who'd somehow, in the space of one dangerous night and morning, made her feel less alone than she'd felt in months. "So am I," she admitted, then hurried away before she could say more, as the passengers prepared to board the patched-up coach. Clara wrapped Luke's blanket carefully and returned it to him. Their fingers brushed in the exchange, and she saw in his eyes the same awareness that burned in her of time running out, of words unspoken, of a connection that defied logic but felt as real as the desert sun. The coach rolled out of Hayfield Station, carrying Clara toward an uncertain future, but as she watched Luke take his position beside the driver, rifle ready, scanning the horizon with those steady gray eyes, she found herself questioning everything she thought she'd decided about her life. Behind them, the bullet-scarred station stood testament to the night's violence. Ahead lay more miles of dangerous trail, but something had changed in the space between one sunrise and the next, something that would not be easily forgotten or dismissed. The desert stretched endlessly before them, but for the first time since Samuel's death, Clara didn't feel entirely alone in its vastness. The morning sun climbed higher as the stagecoach pressed on through the desert, each mile taking Clara further from the violence at Hayfield Station and closer to an inevitable parting. Inside the coach, the other passengers had fallen into exhausted silence, the night's terrors finally catching up with them. Ellen dozed fitfully against James's shoulder, while the merchant stared out the window with hollow eyes. Even Doc had abandoned his cards, lost in private thoughts. Clara found herself watching Luke through the window, memorizing the set of his shoulders, the way he moved in harmony with his horse, the constant vigilance that never wavered despite his wounds. She told herself she was being foolish, that one night of shared danger didn't constitute a connection worth preserving. But her heart, treacherous organ that it was, refused to listen to reason. They reached Benson Station at midday, where the stage line terminated. The town sprawled before them, a collection of adobe buildings, wooden storefronts, and dreams baked hard by the desert sun. This was where Clara would need to arrange further passage east, where Luke would turn back to prepare for another run, where their paths would diverge as surely as the trails that spider-webbed out from the town. As the coach rolled to a stop outside the stage office, Clara gathered her few belongings with hands that wanted to tremble. Through the window, she saw Luke dismount, his movements stiff from the long ride and his injuries. He helped Tom Briggs secure the coach, then turned to assist the passengers. When he offered Clara his hand to help her down, she took it, feeling the calluses and strength, the warmth that seemed to travel up her arm and settle somewhere near her heart. Their eyes met and held for a moment that stretched like taffy, sweet and painful all at once. "Mrs. Jennings," he said formally, though his eyes said something else entirely. "I hope your journey continues safely." "Thank you, Mr. Carson," she replied, matching his formal tone even as her pulse quickened. "For everything." The other passengers dispersed quickly. Ellen and James to find lodging, the merchant to the bank, Doc to whatever shadows suited men of his profession. Clara stood on the wooden sidewalk, carpetbag in hand, suddenly uncertain. The stage office loomed before her, gateway to the future she'd planned, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. "The eastbound don't leave until tomorrow morning," Luke said, still standing nearby. "You'll need a place for the night, Mrs. Patterson runs a respectable boarding house 2 streets over." "Thank you," Clara said again, the words inadequate for everything she wanted to express. Luke touched his hat brim and turned to go, and Clara felt something inside her break loose, some last restraint born of grief and fear and the need to protect herself from further hurt. "Luke," she called. He turned back immediately, hope flickering in those gray eyes. Clara struggled for words. How did one say goodbye to a possibility? How did one walk away from the first spark of life she'd felt since Samuel's death? "I wanted you to know that last night. What you did, who you are. It mattered. It all mattered." Luke crossed the distance between them in 3 strides, stopping just short of impropriety. "Clara," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I know we've known each other less than 2 days. I know you're grieving, that you have plans, but I also know I'll regret it for the rest of my life if I don't say this." She waited, heart hammering, as he searched for words. "I've been riding alone for 8 years, he continued. "Thought I'd made my peace with it. Then you stepped onto that coach, and something in me recognized something in you, like calling to I can't explain it better than that." "You don't have to," Clara whispered. "I felt it too." "Then stay," he said simply. "Not for me, I wouldn't ask that. But stay long enough to figure out if what you're running to is really where you want to go." Clara looked down the dusty street, seeing the life that waited for her here, hard, uncertain, but suddenly full of possibility. Then she looked at Luke, this man who'd shown her that her heart wasn't as dead as she'd believed, who'd reminded her that courage came in many forms. "I need to think," she said finally. "I need—" "Time," Luke finished. "I understand. I'll be here 3 days, resting up before the return run." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small object. "Here." It was a silver compass, worn smooth by years of handling. Clara recognized it as the one he'd consulted during their night journey, checking their direction when the trails became uncertain. "I can't take this," she protested. "Consider it a loan," Luke said, pressing it into her hand. "Something to help you find your way. You can return it when you've decided." The weight of the compass in her palm felt significant, like holding someone's trust in physical form. Clara closed her fingers around it, feeling the metal warm to her touch. 3 days, she repeated. 3 days. Luke touched his hat again and walked away, leaving Clara standing on the sidewalk with a compass and a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She watched him disappear around a corner, then looked down at the compass. The needle pointed steadily north, unwavering in its certainty. If only her own internal compass could be so sure. She found Mrs. Patterson's boarding house exactly where Luke had said it would be. A 2-story adobe structure with a wooden veranda and lace curtains in the windows. Mrs. Patterson herself proved to be a widow of middle years with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Clara of her own mother. "You were on the coach that got attacked, Mrs. Patterson said. More statement than question. "Word travels fast here. You're lucky Luke Carson was riding guard. Best man with a gun in the territory, and decent besides, which is rarer than gold in these parts." Clara murmured agreement, following the woman to a small but clean room on the second floor. When Mrs. Patterson left her to settle in, Clara sat on the narrow bed and finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of the past 24 hours. She'd left Tucson expecting nothing more than safe passage to a new life. Instead, she'd found danger, violence, and most unexpectedly, a connection she hadn't been looking for and didn't know how to handle. She pulled out Luke's compass, watching the needle find its true direction with unwavering certainty. Through her window, she could see the town going about its business, merchants hawking wares, women in calico dresses navigating the dusty streets, cowboys riding in from the ranches. It was a hard life here, no doubt. But it was life, vibrant and real and immediate, in a way that her planned exile to the east now seemed pale and distant. That evening, Clara took her meal in Mrs. Patterson's dining room, sharing the table with other boarders, a school marm from Kansas, a surveyor heading to California, a minister's widow who'd decided to stay west after her husband's death rather than return to family in Pennsylvania. "Been here 2 years now," the widow, Mrs. Grayson, told Clara over coffee. "My sister writes every month begging me to come home, but this is home now. Strange how that happens." "Don't you find it difficult?" Clara asked. "Being alone out here?" Mrs. Grayson smiled. "Who says I'm alone? I've got my students, my church work, my garden. And there's a freedom here, Mrs. Jennings, that women like us don't find in the East. The frontier doesn't care about your past, only your grit." That night, Clara lay wakeful, turning the compass over in her hands and thinking about paths taken and not taken. She thought about Samuel, about the life they'd built together and the dreams that had died with him. She thought about her cousin's letter, about the millinery shop that would never materialize, about the suffocating propriety of Eastern society that awaited her. And she thought about Luke Carson, about gray eyes that saw her truly, about a connection forged in danger but anchored in something deeper. She thought about his words, like calling to like. The next morning, Clara woke with a strange sense of clarity. She dressed carefully and ventured out into the town, Luke's compass in her pocket. She had 2 more days to decide, and she intended to use them wisely. She visited the general store, the school, the small church at the end of Main Street. She talked to people, the banker's wife who'd started a lending library, the Mexican seamstress who'd built a thriving business, the former saloon girl who now ran a restaurant. Each woman had a story of loss, of starting over, of finding unexpected strength in this unforgiving land. The desert either breaks you or makes you stronger. The restaurant owner, Kate, told her, "No middle ground out here." That afternoon, Clara found herself at the stage office, staring at the schedule board. The eastbound stage left at dawn, a ticket to Kansas City, then rail connections to anywhere she wanted to go. Safety, familiarity, a life that would ask nothing of her but propriety and resignation. "Help you, ma'am?" the clerk asked. Clara fingered the compass in her pocket, feeling its solid weight. "Not just yet," she said. "I'm still considering my options." She walked back to the boarding house as the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. From somewhere came the sound of a guitar and voices raised in song. The town was settling into evening. Another day survived and celebrated in small ways. In her room, Clara placed the compass on the small bedside table and watched the needle find its way. Tomorrow she would have to decide. Tomorrow she would have to choose between the safety of the known and the uncertainty of possibility. Tomorrow she would have to determine whether the connection she felt with Luke Carson was worth risking her heart again. But tonight, she simply held the compass and thought about directions, not just the cardinal points marked on its face. but the invisible paths that led to different futures. She thought about Luke somewhere in this same town, perhaps wondering if she would stay or go, if what had passed between them would be enough to overcome fear and logic and the weight of the past. 3 days. He'd said 2 were nearly gone. Clara closed her eyes and tried to imagine boarding that eastbound stage, watching this town disappear behind her, never knowing what might have been. Then she tried to imagine staying, building something new from the ashes of her old life, taking a chance on a gray-eyed guard who'd kept his promise to see her through safe. Neither future was certain. Both required courage, but only one made her heart beat faster with something that felt dangerously like hope. The compass needle pointed steadily north, but Clara was beginning to understand that sometimes the truest direction wasn't marked on any map. Sometimes it was found in the space between one heartbeat and the next, in the moment when fear gave way to faith, in the decision to stop running and start living again. 2 more days, 1 more night to decide. Outside her window, the desert stars emerged one by one, mapping out their own eternal directions across the darkening sky. The eastbound stage left Benson without Clara Jennings aboard. She stood at her boarding house window, watching the coach disappear into the morning haze, carrying with it her planned escape to a safer, smaller life. In her hand, Luke's compass caught the early light, its needle steady as her resolve had finally become. 3 days had passed, and with them, Luke Carson had departed on his return run to Tucson. He'd left without seeking her out, respecting her need for time and space to decide. But Clara had seen him from her window that final morning, checking his rifle, conferring with the new driver, his movements efficient and purposeful as always. Only once had he glanced toward the boarding house, and in that brief moment, Clara had seen everything he wouldn't say: hope, resignation, and the kind of quiet strength that had first drawn her to him. Now he was gone, and Clara was alone in a town where she knew no one. With little money and no clear plan beyond the decision to stay, the compass in her hand seemed to mock her with its certainty. She'd chosen a direction, but the path ahead remained shrouded in desert dust and doubt. "You missed your stage," Mrs. Patterson observed from the doorway, her tone carefully neutral. "Yes," Clara replied simply. "I've decided to remain in Benson for a while." "Well then, you'll be needing work. Can't live on savings forever, and I suspect yours ain't extensive." The older woman's eyes were knowing, but not unkind. "You any good with a needle?" "Tolerably so. Mrs. Chen runs the seamstress shop on 2nd Street. She's been looking for help. Respectable work for a widow." Mrs. Patterson paused at the door. "That Luke Carson's a good man. Just thought you should know that, in case it factors into your calculations." After she left, Clara allowed herself a small smile. Nothing stayed secret long in a frontier town. It seemed. She pinned up her hair, smoothed her best dress, and ventured out to face her new life. Mercy's Bend, for that was the town's full name. She learned, proved to be larger than she'd first thought. Beyond the main street lay a network of smaller roads, adobe houses mixing with wooden structures, Mexican and Anglo communities intersecting in the complicated dance of frontier life. The morning air carried the scent of fresh bread from the bakery, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cattle from the stockyards. Mrs. Chen's shop occupied a narrow building squeezed between a saddlery and a barber. The proprietress herself was a surprise. A Chinese woman of middle years with elegant hands and shrewd eyes who spoke English with only the slightest accent. "You have experience, Mrs. Chen asked, examining Clara's stitching on a handkerchief sample. "My mother taught me, and I've made most of my own clothing." "Western women need practical clothes. Can you work with heavy fabric, canvas, leather?" "I can learn." Mrs. Chen studied her for a long moment. "You were on the stage that was attacked, the one Luke Carson guarded." "Yes. He brought me a torn coat once, bullet hole through the sleeve. I mended it so well you couldn't tell it had been damaged." She smiled slightly. "He's particular about his clothes. Likes things done right. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice steady. I appreciate precision in all things. Good. You start tomorrow. 6 days a week. Half day on Saturday. The pay isn't much, but it's honest work. Clara left the shop with employment secured and a strange mix of relief and trepidation. She'd taken the first step into this new life, but the enormity of what she'd done, staying in a rough frontier town with no family, no connections beyond a 3-day acquaintance with a stage guard, threatened to overwhelm her. The following weeks fell into a rhythm of work and gradual adjustment. Mrs. Chen proved to be a fair employer and a skilled teacher, introducing Clara to the intricacies of frontier tailoring. The work was hard. Her fingers ached from pushing needles through tough canvas, and her back protested the long hours bent over fabric. But it was also satisfying in a way her life as a rancher's wife had rarely been. The shop served everyone from Mexican vaqueros needing sturdy work clothes to the banker's wife wanting the latest fashion from Godey's Lady's Book adapted to frontier practicality. Clara learned to reinforce seams for hardware, to add hidden pockets for derringers, to let out waistbands for expanding prosperity. But it was the evenings that proved hardest. Alone in her boarding house room, with only the compass for company, Clara fought waves of doubt and loneliness. What was she doing here? What future could she build in this dust-blown town? And always, underlying everything, the question of Luke Carson. When would he return? And what would happen when he did? News of the stage routes filtered into town regularly. Clara learned to listen without seeming to, gathering intelligence from customers' casual gossip. The Morrison gang had been captured by cavalry near the border. The Apache were quiet for now. The stage from Tucson had been delayed by flash floods in Skeleton Canyon. It was that last piece of news that made her heart clench. Luke was on that run. She'd calculated the days, knew his schedule as surely as she knew the stitches in a French seam. When the stage finally arrived, a full day late and mud-splattered, Clara had to force herself not to rush to the depot like some lovesick girl. But Luke didn't come to find her. Not that day, nor the next. Clara tried to convince herself it was for the best. What had passed between them had been born of extreme circumstances. Nothing more. He'd probably thought better of his impulsive words, realized the folly of entangling himself with a grieving widow. On the third evening after his return, Clara was working late in the shop, finishing a riding skirt for the doctor's daughter, when she heard the bell above the door chime. "We're closed," she called without looking up. "I can come back." Luke's voice sent the needle skittering across the fabric. Clara looked up to find him standing in the doorway, hat in hand, looking uncertain in a way she'd never seen from him before. "No," she said quickly. "That is, I'm nearly finished. Please, come in." He entered slowly, his presence filling the small shop. In the lamplight, Clara could see new lines around his eyes, a half-healed cut on his jaw. "Rough trip?" she asked, trying for casual conversation while her heart performed acrobatics. "Some trouble near Dragoon Springs?" "Nothing we couldn't handle." He paused, seeming to search for words. "I heard you stayed." "Yes, but not why." Clara set down her sewing, finally meeting his eyes fully. "I think you know why." The silence stretched between them, heavy with everything unsaid. Then Luke reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wrapped package. "I brought you something," he said, placing it on the counter between them. "From Tucson." Clara unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small sewing kit in tooled leather, the kind of luxury item she'd never have purchased for herself. The leather was beautiful, decorated with a pattern of desert roses. "It's lovely," she breathed. "But you shouldn't have. I wanted to. Saw it and thought." He trailed off, then started again. "Clara, I need to know. Did you stay for the town? For the work? Or—" "I stayed for the possibility," she interrupted softly. "For the chance to find out if what I felt during those 3 days was real or just the product of danger and moonlight." "And?" Clara came around the counter, closing the distance between them until she could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. "It's real. Inconvenient and illogical, and probably foolish, but real. Luke's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "I've thought about you every mile of every run, wondered if I'd imagined it all." "You didn't," Clara whispered. When he kissed her, it was nothing like the desperate passion she'd shared with Samuel in their youth. This was deeper, steadier, two people who'd already been broken by life choosing to risk themselves again. Clara tasted dust and determination on his lips, felt the solid strength of him anchoring her to this moment, this choice. When they parted, both breathing unsteadily, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I'm not an easy man to be with," he warned. "Gone half the time, in danger the other half. It's no life for a woman who's already lost." "Stop!" Clara placed her fingers over his lips. "I know what I'm choosing. I've had 2 months to think about it, to watch you ride in and out of town, to imagine all the ways this could go wrong. But Luke, I've also imagined the ways it could go right." He caught her hand, pressing it to his chest where she could feel his heart beating strong and steady. "I can't promise you safety. Can't promise I'll always come back." "I'm not asking for promises," Clara said. "I'm asking for whatever time we have. That's all any of us get anyway." Luke was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then he smiled, a real smile that transformed his weathered features. "Then I'd like to court you proper, Mrs. Jennings, take you to Sunday dinner, walk you home from church. All of it." "I'd like that," Clara replied, feeling oddly shy suddenly. "Though people will talk. Let 'em. I've faced down outlaws and Apaches. I reckon I can handle a few gossiping biddies." Clara laughed, the sound surprising her with its lightness. When was the last time she'd truly laughed? She couldn't remember. They talked quietly as Clara finished her sewing. Luke telling her about the latest run, the passengers he'd protected, the changing conditions on the trail. It was comfortable, this sharing of daily life, more intimate in its way than their dramatic first meeting. When it came time to walk her home, Luke offered his arm with old-fashioned courtesy. The evening was cool, stars beginning to emerge above the town. A few people nodded greetings, and Clara saw curtains twitch as they passed. But she found she didn't care. Let them look. Let them see that Clara Jennings, widow, was choosing to live again. At the boarding house gate, Luke paused. "I leave again in 4 days. Another run to Tucson." "I know." Clara had memorized the schedule by now. "I'll be here when you get back." "That's all I need to know." He lifted her hand, kissing it gently. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Luke." She watched him walk away. This man who'd entered her life in violence and uncertainty, but had somehow become her compass point, her true north in a world that had spun off its axis. In her pocket, his actual compass rested warm and solid, no longer needed for direction now that she'd found her way. Inside her room, Clara looked around at the small space that had become home, her sewing from Mrs. Chen's scattered on the table, her few dresses hanging on pegs, the narrow bed where she'd spent so many restless nights wondering if she'd made the right choice. Now she knew. The right choice wasn't always the safe choice. Sometimes it was the one that made your heart beat faster, that offered not guarantees but possibilities, that reminded you that life was meant to be lived, not just endured. 4 days until Luke left again. But he would return, and she would be here, building a life stitch by stitch, day by day, in this unlikely place that had become her salvation. Clara picked up the leather sewing kit Luke had given her, running her fingers over the tooled roses. In the desert, roses bloomed briefly but fiercely, defying the harsh conditions through sheer determination to live. She understood that now, understood it in her bones. Tomorrow she would work at Mrs. Chen's, would face the knowing looks and whispered speculations about the widow and the stage guard. But tonight, she held hope in her hands like a finely crafted gift, and for the first time since Samuel's death, looked forward to what the morning might bring. Winter came to the desert with surprising ferocity that year. The mountains wore caps of snow, and bitter winds swept down into the valley where Mercy's Bend huddled against the cold. Clara had never experienced a desert winter. The dramatic temperature drops, the way frost could paint the cacti silver in the morning only to give way to blazing afternoon sun. She'd been in town 6 months now, her life settling into patterns that felt both foreign and familiar. Her work at Mrs. Chen's had expanded as her skills grew, and she'd even begun taking in private alterations at the boarding house. The leather sewing kit Luke had given her saw daily use, its tooled roses worn smooth by her fingers. But underneath the routine lay a current of unease that had nothing to do with the weather. The news had started as whispers, fragments overheard at the general store or mentioned in passing by customers. The Morrison gang had escaped from custody. Wells Fargo had increased the bounty. Stage routes were being altered. Schedules changed without warning. And Luke's runs had become more dangerous. He never spoke of it directly, but Clara could read the signs. The way he checked his weapons more carefully before each departure. The new lines of tension around his eyes. The occasional unexplained cuts and bruises that he dismissed with vague mentions of rough road. Now, 3 days before Christmas, Clara stood at the shop window watching snow fall on Main Street. Luke was late. The stage from Tucson should have arrived yesterday morning, but there'd been no word, no explanation, just silence that grew heavier with each passing hour. Worrying won't bring him faster, Mrs. Chen said gently, appearing at Clara's elbow with a cup of tea. I know. Clara accepted the tea gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm ceramic. But knowing and feeling are different things. This is the life you chose, Mrs. Chen reminded her. Not unkindly. The waiting, the uncertainty, it's the price of loving such men. Clara had learned, over the months, that Mrs. Chen understood more than most about loving difficult men. Her own husband had been a railroad worker, killed in a tunnel explosion years before. She'd never remarried, pouring her energy into the business he'd helped her start. How did you bear it? Clara asked. The not knowing. By living, Mrs. Chen replied simply, by refusing to let fear steal the present while waiting for futures that might never come. Your Luke is strong, skilled, trust in that. But as another day passed with no word, trust became harder to maintain. Clara went through the motions of normalcy, working, eating, sleeping, while inside, a familiar dread built. She'd felt this same icy fear the day Samuel hadn't returned from checking the northern pastures, the day she'd found him lying too still in the dust, his life spilled out on ground that didn't care about her love or her loss. On the evening of the second day, as Clara was closing the shop, Tom Briggs appeared in the doorway. The old driver looked haggard, trail dust thick on his clothes despite the winter cold. Mrs. Jennings, he said, and Clara's heart stopped at his tone. Where is he? The words came out harsh, desperate. Doc Morrison's place. He's alive, Tom added quickly as Clara swayed. But he took a bullet. Bad one. Clara was moving before he finished speaking, leaving the shop unlocked, her shawl forgotten. The snow had turned to sleet, stinging her face as she ran through the darkening streets. Other people called out to her, but she didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Not until she burst through the door of Doc Morrison's surgery. The smell hit her first. Blood and carbolic acid, and that particular scent of pain sweat she remembered from Samuel's last moments. Luke lay on the examination table, his shirt cut away, revealing a mass of bandages around his midsection. His face was pale as the snow outside, his breathing shallow. He's stable, Doc Morrison said, looking up from washing his hands. The bullet went through clean, missed the vital organs, but he lost a lot of blood, and there's always risk of infection. Clara approached slowly, her legs suddenly unsteady. Luke's eyes were closed, dark lashes stark against his pallor. She reached out, hesitating just before touching him, afraid he might dissolve like a desert mirage. What happened? She asked Tom, who'd followed her in. Ambush at Sulphur Springs. 4 of them, maybe 5. Luke saw them first, gave us time to fort up. Tom's voice was thick with exhaustion and admiration. Picked off 2 before they got him, Rest scattered when they realized we weren't easy pickings. Morrison gang? Most like, they knew our route, our timing. Someone's feeding them information. Clara filed this away to worry about later. Right now, all that mattered was the rise and fall of Luke's chest, the faint pulse she could see at his throat. "Can I stay?" she asked Doc Morrison. "He'll need watching through the night. Fever's the danger now. You know what to do?" Clara nodded. She'd nursed Samuel through pneumonia once, had tended her mother in her final illness. She knew the vigil of the sick room, the careful monitoring of temperature and breathing, the endless hours of waiting for crisis or recovery. Doc Morrison left, promising to return at dawn. Tom Briggs squeezed her shoulder before departing to see to the exhausted passengers and salvage what he could of the schedule. And Clara was left alone with Luke in the quiet sounds of a building settling into night. She pulled a chair close to the table, taking Luke's hand in both of hers. It was cold, too cold. The calluses and strength she knew so well now vulnerable in unconsciousness. "You promised to see me through safe," she whispered. "Don't you dare break that promise now." The hours crawled by. Clara bathed Luke's face with cool water when fever rose, covered him with extra blankets when chills shook his frame. She talked to him quietly about the shop, about Mrs. Chen's latest attempts to teach her Chinese embroidery, about the Christmas service planned at the church. Anything to fill the silence, to anchor him to this world with the sound of her voice. Near midnight, his eyes opened, focusing with her effort on her face. "Clara?" His voice was barely a whisper. "I'm here." She squeezed his hand, blinking back tears of relief. "You're safe. You're in Doc Morrison's surgery. The passengers? All fine, thanks to you." She smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "Tom told me what you did." Luke tried to shift, winced, and thought better of it. "Had to protect my reason for coming back." Despite everything, Clara felt a smile tug at her lips. "Even half dead, you're still trying to court me. Man's gotta have priorities." His attempt at a smile turned into a grimace of pain. "Rest," Clara ordered. "Save your strength for getting well. You can court me properly when you're not bleeding all over Doc Morrison's table." Luke's eyes were already closing again, but his hand tightened on hers. "Stay? Wild horses couldn't drag me away." She kept her word, maintaining her vigil through the long night. The fever rose and broke twice, each time leaving Luke weaker but clearer-headed. By dawn, when Doc Morrison returned, the immediate crisis had passed. "He'll make it," the doctor pronounced after a thorough examination. "Thanks in no small part to your nursing, but he'll need weeks to heal properly. No riding, no lifting, no heroics." "I'll make sure of it," Clara said, exhaustion making her voice hoarse. Luke, more alert now, managed a weak protest. "Can't afford. Weeks off. Wells Fargo can find another guard for a few runs." Doc Morrison said firmly, "Unless you'd prefer a permanent replacement when you die of stubbornness." Clara spent the next days split between the shop and Luke's bedside. Mrs. Chen, understanding as always, adjusted the schedule to accommodate Clara's new responsibilities. The other stage drivers stopped by with news and encouragement, forming a protective brotherhood around their wounded comrade. It was Tom Briggs who brought the most significant news. 4 days after the ambush, "They caught 2 of them," he announced, satisfaction evident in his weathered face. "Army patrol found them holed up near the border. One of them talked to save his neck. And?" Luke asked from his bed, where he was chafing at enforced inactivity despite Clara's stern supervision. "There's been a clerk at the Wells Fargo office selling schedules and route information. They arrested him this morning." Tom's expression darkened. "Been at it for months. Apparently, every run we made, they knew about." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter weather. All those months of Luke riding into danger, with enemies who knew exactly where and when to find him. The thought of how many close calls there might have been, how many times she'd waited unknowing while he faced orchestrated threats, made her stomach turn. "It's over now," Luke said, reading her expression. They'll be more careful with information, and the gang scattered. But Clara heard what he didn't say, that there would always be another gang, another threat, another bullet with his name on it. This was the life she'd chosen, the price of loving a man who stood between civilization and chaos. That evening, as Luke dozed fitfully, Clara sat by the window watching snow fall on Mercy's Bend. The town looked peaceful, almost pretty under its white blanket. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could hear distant laughter from the saloon, the ordinary sounds of people living their lives. Having second thoughts, Luke's voice was stronger now, more like himself. Clara turned to find him watching her, those gray eyes as perceptive as ever despite his injuries. "No," she said, returning to his bedside. "Just thinking about prices and choices." "I'd understand," he said quietly. "If this isn't what you want, if it's too much like before." Clara considered her words carefully. "When Samuel died, I thought I'd never risk my heart again. The pain seemed too high a price for love." She took Luke's hand, careful of his injuries. "But these past months have taught me something. The pain of loss is terrible, yes, but the pain of never truly living, that's worse." Luke brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "I can't promise—" "I'm not asking for promises," Clara interrupted. "I'm asking for whatever time we have, whether it's days or years or decades. I'm asking to share your life, dangers and all, because a life without you in it isn't one I want anymore." "Clara Jennings," Luke said, his voice rough with emotion. "You humble me." "Good," she replied with a watery smile. "A little humility will help with your recovery. Doc Morrison says humble patients heal faster. He said no such thing. Well, he should have." They sat quietly for a while, hands linked, watching the snow fall. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, Luke's continued recovery, the ongoing threat of frontier violence, the daily struggles of building a life in a hard land. But tonight, they were together, alive, and choosing hope over fear. "I love you," Luke said suddenly, the words filling the quiet room like a benediction. Clara leaned down to kiss him gently, mindful of his injuries. "I love you too," she whispered against his lips. "Stubborn, heroic fool that you are." Outside, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to Christmas Eve service. Clara heard them distantly, but she had no intention of leaving Luke's side. She'd found her own form of faith here, in this small room that smelled of carbolic and determination, in the hands of a man who'd taught her that courage meant not the absence of fear, but the decision to love despite it. The bells continued their celebration, and snow continued to fall, and Clara Jennings continued her vigil over the man who'd promised to see her through safe and had kept that promise at nearly the cost of his own life. She thought perhaps that was what love really was, not safety or certainty, but the willingness to stand guard over each other's hearts, whatever storms might come. Spring came to the desert like a kept promise, painting the harsh landscape in unexpected colors. Brittle bush bloomed yellow against red rocks, and the mighty saguaros crowned themselves with white flowers. It had been 3 months since the ambush at Sulphur Springs, and Luke Carson was finally healed enough to resume his duties, though Clara noticed he still favored his left side on cold mornings. The evening was unseasonably warm, and Clara sat on the wooden bench outside Mrs. Chen's shop, taking advantage of the fading light to finish some delicate needlework. The past months had deepened her relationship with Luke from courtship into something more solid, more real. He'd moved from Doc Morrison's to a room at the Frontier House, close enough to visit daily but maintaining the proprieties that mattered in a small town. She heard his boots on the boardwalk before she saw him, recognizing that particular rhythm of his walk. When she looked up, he was standing before her with an expression she'd never seen before, nervous, almost boyish, despite his 38 years and weathered features. "Evening walk?" Clara asked, setting aside her sewing. "Something like that." Luke shifted his weight, and Clara noticed his right hand kept moving to his coat pocket. "Clara, would you walk with me? There's something I need to say." intrigued and slightly concerned. Clara rose and took his offered arm. They walked in silence through the town, past the mercantile and the bank, past the saloon where piano music spilled into the street. Luke led her toward the small park near the church, where cottonwood trees provided shade and a sense of privacy. "You're worrying me," Clara said when he stopped near the old well that served as the park's centerpiece. "Has something happened? Is the gang—" "No, nothing like that." Luke took a deep breath, and Clara realized with a start that his hands were trembling. This man who'd faced down outlaws without flinching was shaking like a schoolboy. "Clara, I've been thinking. About time, about chances, about the things we can't control and the things we can—" He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. In the dying light, his gray eyes were almost silver, intense, with purpose. "I've spent the last 15 years believing I'd had my chance at happiness. After Mary died, I thought that was it for me. Just work and duty and getting through each day." He paused, struggling for words. "Then you stepped onto that stage, and everything I thought I knew about my life turned upside down." "Luke, let me finish," he said gently. "I need to say this right." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out a small leather pouch. "I went back to Tucson last week, not for a run. Tom took that one. I went for this." He opened the pouch and tipped its contents into his palm. A ring gleamed in the fading light. Not fancy, not ornate, but solid silver with a small turquoise stone set in the band. It was beautiful in its simplicity, perfect in its unexpected color that matched the desert sky. "I know it's only been 8 months since we met," Luke continued, his voice stronger now. "I know you came here running from loss, not looking for love. But Clara, I also know that when I was bleeding out at Sulphur Springs, the thing that pulled me back wasn't duty or stubbornness. It was you, the thought of you waiting, of the life we could have together." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but she didn't try to stop them. This moment felt too important for pretense. "You spent one daring night with a stagecoach guard," Luke said, a slight smile touching his lips as he referenced their beginning. "Now I'm returning with a ring, hoping you'll spend all your nights with him. Marry me, Clara. Let me promise not just to see you through safe, but to stand beside you through whatever comes." The park was quiet except for the evening songs of birds settling for the night. Clara looked at the ring, at Luke's hopeful face, at the life he was offering. She thought of all the reasons to say no, the danger of his profession, the harshness of frontier life, the risk of loss that came with any deep love. But she also thought of these past months, of mornings when he'd appear at the shop with coffee and quiet conversation, of evenings walking these same streets and talking about everything and nothing. She thought of his strength during recovery, never complaining despite the pain, more concerned about her exhaustion from nursing him than his own injuries. She thought of the way he looked at her, not as a replacement for what he'd lost, but as herself, complete and complicated and worthy of choosing. When Samuel died, Clara said slowly, "I thought my heart died with him. I thought that was my one chance at love, and the price of losing it was too high to ever risk again." She freed one hand to touch Luke's face, feeling the roughness of his evening stubble, the warmth of his skin. "But you taught me something I didn't expect. Love isn't a limited resource. The heart doesn't run out of chances. It just learns to be braver with each one." "Is that a yes?" Luke asked, hope and uncertainty warring in his expression. "That's a yes," Clara confirmed, laughing through her tears. "Yes, I'll marry you, Luke Carson. Yes to all of it, the danger and the joy, the ordinary days and the frightening ones, the whole beautiful, terrifying adventure of sharing a life." Luke's hands shook slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, the turquoise catching the last rays of sun like a piece of sky made solid. Then he was kissing her, right there in the public park where anyone could see, and Clara found she didn't care one bit about propriety or gossip or anything beyond this moment of choosing happiness over fear. When they finally parted, both breathless, Luke rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said simply. I'll probably never be good with fancy words or grand gestures, but I'll love you steady and true until my last breath. That's all I need. Clara whispered. That's everything. They walked back through town as the stars began to emerge, no longer trying to hide their connection. Clara's ring caught the lamplight from windows they passed, and she saw curtains twitch. Knew the news would be all over Mercy's Bend by morning. Let them talk. Let them see that Clara Jennings, who'd arrived broken and running, had found something worth staying for. When? Luke asked as they reached the boarding house. Soon, Clara replied. Spring is for new beginnings, isn't it? And She paused, suddenly shy. I don't want to wait. We've both learned how uncertain time can be. Next month, Luke suggested. That gives you time to make a dress. Gives me time to find us a proper place to live. Can't keep boarding at the frontier house once I'm a married man. Next month, Clara agreed. Small ceremony, just friends and the people who've become our family here. Luke kissed her again at the gate. Softer this time, a promise more than passion. I'll court you proper until then, he said with a grin. Don't want people saying I didn't do right by you. People will say what they want regardless. Clara pointed out. The important thing is we know the truth, that we're choosing each other, eyes open, hearts sure. After he left, Clara climbed to her room and lit the lamp. Her small space looked different somehow, already transitioning from refuge to temporary stopping place. Soon she'd have a real home again, shared with someone who understood both loss and the courage to continue. She held her hand up to the light, admiring the ring. The turquoise seemed to hold depths, like looking into deep water or endless sky. It wasn't a conventional choice for an engagement ring, but then nothing about her relationship with Luke had been conventional. They'd met in violence, courted through recovery, and built love on the foundation of mutual respect and shared strength. Clara pulled out paper and pen to write to her cousin Martha back east, not to accept that long-ago job offer, but to share news of her engagement, to let her know that the desperate widow who'd sold everything for a ticket to supposed safety had instead found something worth the risk of staying. Dear Martha, she wrote, I hope this letter finds you well. You'll be surprised to hear that I never left Arizona territory. I found work in a town called Mercy's Bend. And more surprisingly, I found love again. His name is Luke Carson, and he's a good man, steady, brave, kind in ways that matter. We're to be married next month. As she wrote, Clara thought about the strange turnings of life. If Samuel hadn't died, if Martha hadn't withdrawn her offer, if Clara had taken a different stage, or Luke had been assigned a different run. So many ifs that could have prevented this moment. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps love was always a matter of timing and chance and the courage to recognize it when it appeared. Through her window, she could hear the night sounds of Mercy's Bend, a dog barking, distant laughter from the saloon, the creak of wagons being secured for the night. This frontier town that had seemed so foreign 8 months ago now felt like home, not because of the place itself, but because of the people who'd made room for her, who'd shown her that starting over was possible at any age, after any loss. Tomorrow she'd begin planning a wedding, would start sewing a dress from the pale blue silk misses Chen had been saving for a special occasion. Tomorrow Luke would return to his dangerous profession, and she'd return to the familiar knot of worry that came with loving someone who courted danger for a living. But tonight, Clara Jennings sat in her small room wearing a turquoise ring and writing a letter full of hope. Tonight, she was a woman who'd learned that the heart's capacity for love was as vast as the desert sky, as enduring as the mountains that stood sentinel over this hard and beautiful land. That night wasn't just one daring night, she whispered to herself, touching the ring. It was the beginning of everything, and in the morning, when the desert bloomed with new life and possibility, she'd be ready to embrace it all. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline desert light that made the whole world seem freshly washed. Clara stood before the small mirror in what would be her last morning at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, adjusting the simple crown of desert wildflowers that Mrs. Chen had woven for her hair. The pale blue silk dress hung perfectly, its clean lines and careful stitching a testament to weeks of work stolen between customer orders. It wasn't elaborate by Eastern standards, but it was hers, made by her own hands for this new beginning. At her throat, she wore her mother's cameo, the one piece of jewelry she'd kept through all the losses and changes. "You look beautiful, Mrs. Patterson said from the doorway, her usually stern features softened by emotion. "Like a woman who knows her own mind and heart." "I feel like one," Clara replied, smoothing the silk one last time. "For the first time in so long, I feel whole." The small church at the end of Main Street had been transformed by willing hands. Tom Briggs and the other stage drivers had hauled in armloads of flowering desert willow and palo verde branches. Ellen and James, the young couple from that fateful first journey, had arrived from Tucson with ribbons and fabric to drape the rough pews. Even Doc Holliday, or whatever his real name was, had contributed, appearing with an inexplicable case of good wine for the celebration. As Clara walked down the aisle on Abraham Washington's offered arm, she saw the faces of people who'd become her community. Mrs. Chen, dignified in embroidered silk. Doc Morrison, who'd saved Luke's life. Martha Washington, who'd fed them all during the crisis. The banker's wife who'd become a regular customer. The Mexican seamstress who'd shared techniques and gossip in equal measure. All here to witness this moment of hope triumphant. But Clara had eyes only for Luke, standing at the altar in his best black suit, looking simultaneously nervous and radiantly happy. The morning light through the church windows caught the silver at his temples, highlighted the lines that spoke of laughter and worry and years under the desert sun. He was no young romantic hero, and she was no blushing bride. They were two people who'd been broken and mended, who understood that love was both more fragile and more resilient than youth ever guessed. Reverend Thomas, himself a widower who'd found new purpose in the territory, spoke simple words about commitment and courage, about building something lasting in a land that challenged everything. Clara heard the words distantly, her attention focused on Luke's gray eyes, on the way his hands held hers steady and sure. "Do you, Clara, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" "I do," Clara said, her voice clear and certain. She'd made these vows before, to another good man in another life. But she understood now that love wasn't diminished by repetition. Each commitment was unique, shaped by who they were in that moment, not who they'd been before. "Do you, Luke, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do you part?" "I do." Luke's voice was rough with emotion, his hands tightening on hers. "Then, by the power vested in me by the territory of Arizona, I now pronounce you man and wife." Reverend Thomas smiled. "You may kiss your bride, Luke." The kiss was gentle, appropriate for the setting, but Clara felt in it all the passion and promise they'd share in private. When they parted, the small congregation erupted in cheers and applause, the sound filling the little church with joy. The celebration continued at the Frontier House, where the proprietor had cleared the dining room for dancing. Clara found herself passed from partner to partner, Tom Briggs surprisingly light on his feet, Abraham Washington courtly and formal, even Doc Morrison taking a turn despite his protests about old bones. But it was the dance with Luke that she'd remember forever, as he held her close, moving to the music of a single fiddle and guitar. She felt the solid reality of him, the miracle of second chances made flesh. "No regrets?" he asked quietly. "For her ears alone?" "Not one," she assured him. "You? Only that I didn't find you sooner." He spun her gently, bringing her back close. "I love you, Mrs. Carson, and I love you, Mr. Carson." The name felt strange and right on her lips, this new identity layered over the old. As the afternoon wore on and the celebration continued, Clara found a moment to step outside. The desert stretched endlessly beyond the town, painted in shades of gold and purple as the sun began its descent. Somewhere out there were the dangers Luke would continue to face, outlaws and harsh weather and all the uncertainties of frontier life. But here, in this moment, there was joy. Luke joined her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "What are you thinking?" "About that first night," Clara said, leaning back against his solid warmth. "How terrified I was, how certain that my life was ending rather than beginning." "And now?" She turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his weathered face. "Now I know that sometimes the best journeys are the ones we never planned to take." They stood together as the sun set, painting the desert in shades of fire. Behind them, their friends and new family celebrated. Before them lay a future neither could fully predict. But Clara had learned that uncertainty wasn't always something to fear. Sometimes it was just another word for possibility. Later, in the small house Luke had rented on the quiet end of Cottonwood Street, they finally had privacy. The bedroom was simple, a brass bed, a wooden dresser, white curtains at the window. But Luke had placed wildflowers in a jar on the nightstand, and Clara's trunk sat beside his in the corner. Their possessions mingled like their lives. "Welcome home," Luke said softly, lighting the oil lamp. Home. The word settled into Clara's heart like a key in a lock. Not just this house, not just this town, but this life she'd built from the ashes of loss. This man who'd promised to see her through safe and had kept that promise in ways neither of them had imagined. As Luke took her in his arms, the turquoise ring on her finger caught the lamplight. She thought fleetingly of that scared widow clutching a rejection letter at a dusty stage stop, of the woman who'd thought her capacity for love had died with her first husband. That woman seemed like a stranger now, or perhaps just an earlier chapter in a story that had taken an unexpected turn. "She spent one daring night with the Stagecoach guard," Luke murmured against her hair, completing their private joke, their origin story. "And he returned with a ring." "The best stories are the true ones," Clara replied, rising on her toes to kiss him. Outside their window, Mercy's Bend settled into evening. The saloon's piano played distantly. Dogs barked their nightly conversations, and somewhere a baby cried and was soothed. Life in all its ordinary glory, made precious by its fragility, made beautiful by the courage to embrace it fully. Clara Carson, formerly Jennings, formerly lost and running, now found and choosing to stay. Let her husband lead her to their marriage bed. In the morning he would return to his dangerous work, and she would return to her sewing, and they would begin the daily labor of building a life together. There would be worries and joys, probably children if they were blessed, certainly challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, in a simple room in a frontier town, two people who'd learned that love could survive loss celebrated the victory of hope over fear. The desert had tested them with its harsh beauty, had demanded they choose between safety and truly living. They'd chosen life, chosen each other, chosen to believe that some chances were worth taking no matter the risk. As the lamp burned low and the desert stars wheeled overhead, Clara thought she finally understood what Luke had meant that first night when he'd said, "Like calling to like." It wasn't about shared interests or matching temperaments. It was about recognizing another soul who'd been tempered by the same fires, who understood that strength wasn't about never breaking, but about choosing to mend. Who knew that love wasn't a guarantee against loss, but the only thing that made loss bearable. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, Clara Carson fell asleep in her husband's arms, listening to his steady breathing, feeling his heartbeat against her palm. She'd traveled so far from that terrified widow at the stage stop, had discovered reserves of courage she'd never known she possessed. And it had all started with one daring night, one dangerous journey, one gray-eyed guard who'd kept his promise in ways that went far beyond mere physical safety. The desert wind sang its ancient song outside their window, and Clara smiled in the darkness. She was home at last. Not in a place, but in a person. Not in safety, but in the glorious risk of love fully embraced. And that, she thought as sleep claimed her, was the greatest adventure of all. The turquoise ring gleamed softly in the starlight. A fragment of desert sky made into a promise, a reminder that sometimes the most beautiful things were born from pressure and time and the courage to say yes when life offered second chances. In Mercy's Bend, Arizona Territory, 1874, Clara and Luke Carson began their married life with full hearts and open eyes, ready for whatever the sunrise might bring. Thank you so much for listening to this Wild West love story. I hope Clara and Luke's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while sharing it. Where are you listening from today? Please comment below and let me know. I love connecting with listeners from all around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel for more tales of courage, romance, and adventure from America's frontier days. And please, share your thoughts about Clara and Luke's story in the comments. What was your favorite moment? Could you feel the dust and danger of 1874 Arizona? I'd love to hear from you.